What's happening in Colombia? Well, what happened recently is most recently with these there's been protests like this in Colombia happening for the last like year, maybe more than a year since COVID. Things have been getting worse. So the background is that the president of Colombia, Ivan Duque, is essentially it's said that he's sort of controlled by the previous president, or not previous president, like kind of earlier presidents. What's important is there was a previous guy called Alvaro Uribe, who's still Uribe, no puedo decir cosas, who's still alive, who's still very powerful, who was like this far-right guy who essentially founded a political movement called Uribismo. Duque is his protege, basically, and it's said that Duque is controlled by him, but I don't think that's really necessary. I'm sure they consult, but I mean, he's a true believer. He doesn't need to be controlled. But essentially, these guys are right-wing, sort of like palatable neoliberal reactionaries who are extremely brutal against leftist movements in the country, extremely brutal when it comes to stuff like the war on drugs. You know, what you would expect from sort of a neoliberal, conservative Latin American sort of government. You know, it's like Pinochet light, basically, these governments, because they're technically not dictatorships, but they do a lot of the same things. Uribe disappeared a fucking ton of people. Honestly, probably more than Pinochet, though it's very difficult to prove, and no one cares because, you know, it's not quite as spectacular when a democratic government does it and they delegate it to like militias so that they have plausible deniability. So that's like the base here, right? So what happened with the recent protests? So Duque raised taxes in two ways, at least that I know of. One was that he lowered the threshold for being subject to income tax to about $600, which is, you know, in Colombia, most people don't make $600, so that's not really a big concern. You know, $600 is a middle class wage in Colombia. It's fairly high. So, but the other thing was that he raised the sales tax on everything by a significant amount, and everyone with a brain knows that sales tax is basically the most regressive sort of tax, because rich people don't care about them and they hit poor people really hard because the percentage increase on the price of goods is huge for a poor person, but it's nothing for someone who would just buy it anyway. And that caused protests because everyone is already suffering due to COVID, and this was like an additional sort of pressure on them. So, you know, people started protesting because of that. And the government pretty much immediately started massacring people. And this resulted in international attention. And only after the international attention came to be, the government was like, okay, I guess we won't pass this tax bill. But as is the case often with stuff like this, right? So people protest. The initial goal of the protest is achieved. But because they've been repressed so much during these protests, right? Everyone is so fucking pissed off that they keep protesting. So people are still protesting. So far, at least 30 people have been killed. Hundreds more have been disappeared in terms of the official figures from like the Colombian Independent Human Rights Ombudsman. And generally, disappeared people in Colombia, in Latin America, you know, in countries like this, they could be dead or they could just be in custody somewhere that you know hasn't really been officially announced yet. So you don't fucking know. We have no clue how many of these people are actually dead. So the death toll could well be much higher than 30. It's been 30 in just about a week. So yeah, pretty fucked up shit. Praise be to Allah. Thank you, brother. And you have like people spreading this very common far-right conspiracy theory in Latin America, which is that whenever there's a protest against a right-wing or centrist government, the conspiracy theory dictates that this protest is caused by interference from Cuba and Venezuela. Okay? You know, it's a very common conspiracy theory, very common scapegoat. Because, you know, this ridiculous idea that Venezuela, which is right now a very poor country without much ability to project influence across the continent, is the only possible reason that anyone could ever want to protest, right? Millions of people protesting in Chile sounds like Venezuela, and Cuba even less so, right? Cuba is a tiny island that cannot project power basically at all in that way, right? Yet you get this idea that Cubans, you know, sends agents to and pays protesters and stuff. It's fucking ludicrous, right? It's just an excuse for right-wing governments to be able to say that It's so common. Like the literal president of Ecuador, by the way, said that the protests in Colombia are caused by Venezuela. Okay? He said that a few days ago. So it's very common. The literal Organization of American States said that the protests in Chile in 2019 were caused by dark winds from Cuba and Venezuela. I'm not making this up. I'll show you right fucking now. Like, this is a very far-reaching conspiracy theory. This article says the Organization of American States blames in attempts, external and internal, for trying to destabilize institutions in Chile. And the OAS statement is here. It says here, the Bolivarian winds of Simon Bolivar brought liberty and independence to our countries. But the breezes from the Bolivarian regimes caused by Maduro and the Cuban regime bring violence, looting, destruction, and attempts and political attempts to attack the democratic system directly, and to try and force interruptions in legitimate constitutional mandates. And they specifically spread the conspiracy theory here that it is happening in Colombia. The attempts that we have seen documented in Ecuador and Colombia today, repeated in Chile. According to them, all of this is caused by dark winds emanating from Cuba and Venezuela. This is an incredibly strong conspiracy theory. It permeates institutions. It's spread by this is not like QAnon, right? It's actual, like, people in governments, in high places, in international bodies saying this shit. Anytime there's a protest against a right-wing government, just baselessly, Cuba, Venezuela, right? And they're saying this about Colombia right now. There's so-called leftists on Twitter saying that Cuba is causing the protest in Colombia, and they're essentially like doing the equivalent of spreading the Nazi cultural Bolshevism conspiracy theory. They're spreading a far-right conspiracy theory that is used to justify the mass murder of protesters. I absolutely just cannot emphasize how much the international left, especially the English-speaking international left, just buys hook, line, and sinker right-wing conspiracy theories. There are quite a few people who believe it. I would say, like, if you poll people, probably like 20-30% of the population would legitimately believe this. But it's because it's been spread so much. It's been spread so much by the right-wing media, by right-wing politicians, by organizations like the Organization of American States, which is supposedly neutral, just blaming any protest. Like I've said before, the idea that the USA can just cause protests on the scale of, like, Hong Kong, for example, on the scale of Myanmar, by themselves, without there being any legitimate impulse to protest, without people having legitimate reasons to protest, without them wanting to protest themselves, right, is fucking ludicrous. It's even more fucking ludicrous applied to Cuba and Venezuela, two countries that are nowhere near as powerful as the US, that are both relatively small, especially Cuba, and that have so many internal issues to deal with right now already, and have, don't even have the resources to do this sort of thing. And, even if theoretically they were involved in these protests, which they aren't, by the way, so I'm just giving sort of credence to an argument that is based on a false premise, that fact would not even remotely override the fact that you have hundreds of thousands of fucking people protesting in the street because they don't have fucking food to eat, because they can't afford to buy basic items because you raise taxes on them.
Praise be to Allah.
Praise be to Allah, brother. Cuba and Venezuela cannot cause protests of hundreds of thousands of people, okay? The USA cannot cause protests of millions of people, okay? They may, in the US case, the other two definitely do not do this in any sort of manner that makes any real difference to anything. The USA can sort of influence sort of smaller scale protests. They can try their best to sort of foment protests, etc. But whatever's going on, the CIA could only fucking dream of causing a protest movement of like 1 million people, hundreds of thousands of people, etc. Let alone the fucking Cuba and Venezuela. So these people spreading these right-wing conspiracy theories are just disgusting. Just absolutely fucking gross. And if you doubt what I said, that this is coming from people who think they are leftists on Twitter, there are a lot of gusanos saying this. I'll show you. So this guy was saying, he says he's a social democrat, I think. Yeah, no, democratic socialist, right? Democratic socialist from the USA. The Cuban government foments, funds, and trains most left-wing movements or organizations in Latin America. One, that is an absolutely incredible statement. The Cuban government funds and trains not just left-wing guerrilla movements, of which practically no real left-wing guerrilla movement exists anymore, at least on a sizable, really influential level. Most of them are tiny at this point. And not just that, not just guerrilla movements, but organizations too. Organizations as well, right? So it's essentially saying, basically, left-wing organizations in Latin America, just in the pocket of Cuba, right? That right there is a conspiracy theory for the fucking ages. And then he also says you won't hear about it, as Cuba often always denies its involvement. But sometimes it slips out, and one recent example is in Colombia. Okay? Right there. Guy, democratic socialist from the USA, saying that the protests in Colombia are being caused by dark winds emanating from Cuba. Okay? Like, another one said, the Cuban government's involvement in Colombia doesn't surprise me after they did the same thing in Venezuela. See, that's a 2-for-1 conspiracy theory. The Cuban government caused the crisis in Venezuela, right? They did it. And then the same guy replies saying, they are fucking everywhere. Literally, more conspiracy theory, okay? And this guy says, most of the time disguised as doctors. So he's also spreading another far-right conspiracy theory, which is that Cuban doctors sent to, basically help out healthcare systems that desperately need them are also evil Cuban agents of the Cuban CIA. So this guy links that to this woman. Their reaction is to say, Gusano is when we acknowledge the Cuban government does foreign intervention. And the more foreign intervention we acknowledge, the more Gusano it is. So, like, that is in response to someone spreading a conspiracy theory that the Cuban government causes protests in Colombia and that doctors are spies. And this is a anarcho-femdominist, apparently, which is a good ideology, but this guy is not a great advocate for it, in my opinion. Black Lives Matter and by, someone who clearly considers themselves to be a leftist sort of progressive, spreading a straight-up far-right conspiracy theory in Latin America. It fucking pains me to see you people talk about LATAM. It fucking hurts. It fucking hurts. You just straight up accept, you could have a conversation with anyone who knows this region, who lives here, would immediately spot as, spreading far-right narratives and just eat it hook, line, and sinker. I don't know why people are not skeptical. Like, I can, if I was talking to someone, like, say, from Iraq, I don't know much about local politics in Iraq, but I was talking to someone from Iraq, and I could easily tell what sort of political bent they had, right? I could easily tell, even though I don't know much about Iraq, just from the way they talk about things, just from the framing. For some reason, these fucking Americans just cannot do it. They just cannot. There is no criticism at all. Like, these are the sorts of people who would, like, if Clarín had an English website, they would go there and accept every single article on it, uncritically. By the way, let's go to the article that he used to justify this. So essentially what happened is the Cuban ambassador was expelled, or one of their diplomats was expelled from Colombia. And the reason for this is obviously just because, the Colombian government is looking for a scapegoat for the protests. So they're kind of virtue signaling by expelling a Cuban diplomat, saying, wow, we expelled them. They must be involved somehow, right? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So essentially the only source here is this, right? That the Colombian far-right government expelled the Cuban diplomat. The justification for this guy's claim that Cuba is causing the protests in Colombia is the far-right Colombian government itself. And this is a guy who considers himself a democratic socialist, okay? Just such a great fucking example. Yeah, it's one guy, right? But this is a great example. This is not just something that's limited to this one guy. This is something that happens all the fucking time when it comes to Latin America, when it comes to anywhere else in the rest of the world. Just straight up people uncritically lapping up shit that so obviously comes from shitty sources, that is so obviously a far-right narrative, without a single ounce of fucking skepticism at all. There was a interesting story from of an Argentine. Oh, he was freed finally, fucking hell, in November. What happened is there was this guy, in the 2019 Bolivia stuff, and there was this Argentine who used to be a member of the FARC, which is a Colombian guerrilla group, right? 5-10 years ago, he was a member of FARC, and he was in Bolivia as a photographer for a leftist magazine in Argentina, right? He left the group and he was living in Argentina, but he was in Bolivia temporarily doing photography for this magazine, right? So when Áñez took power, she goes looking for sort of sort of justifications for what she was doing, for the protests against her not being legitimate, etc. And she finds this guy, photographing the protests, etc., and says, "Oh, it's a foreigner. This Argentine guy has a tenuous link to the FARC from ages ago. This is proof that FARC is orchestrating the protest against us. Never mind that we just did a coup. Never mind that we're massacring indigenous people in the streets. It's all FARC. This one guy photographing the protest proves it." Jesus, what the fuck did they do to him? Like, come on. They also randomly basically rounded up a bunch of Venezuelans, Venezuelan immigrants to Bolivia, and said, these are Venezuelans, therefore they are agents of Maduro and they are causing the protest. This is the exact same thing. It's a case that is repeated all over fucking Latin America. It happened in Chile. It's happening in Colombia now. It happened in Bolivia. Happened in Ecuador. Anytime there are protests against a right-wing government, it is claimed to be the result of Cuban or Venezuelan
Communism
infiltration.
is based.
I don't know. Maybe I need to make an entire whole video about this, because honestly, I think too much of Americans sometimes. I think too much of them. For me, this is shit that should be obvious. I can spot a far-right narrative in any country because they share a lot of similarities. And I also like to look up things myself rather than just hearing about shit that some random person tweeted out and then adopting it as my own opinion immediately, right? But people, for some reason, need this shit explained. That if a far-right government tells you that protests against them are being caused by another country, you should probably be skeptical of that. So yeah, I mean, that's basically my treatise. How do you pronounce the word? Treatise? Whatever. On the whole Colombia thing and sort of the wider way that protests in Latin America are commonly framed.